Test, test.
There you go.
Test, test. Good? Put that. Kind of just put that on my.
Good evening. Good evening. Let me do a mic check from here. Oh, that's good. There we go. We're ready. Welcome to the 2016-2017 Lectures in Catholic Experience. A special welcome to any of you who may be here at St. Jerome's University for the first time. We're very happy that you could be with us this evening. And I want to extend a special welcome tonight to Father Ron McDonnell of the Scarborough Missions, who are supporting tonight's lecture. I want to begin this evening by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The university is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the 6 nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. My name is Christina Vanine, and I'm Associate Dean here at St. Jerome's University, and I coordinate this year's lecture series. I want to be sure before we get started, if you haven't already done so, would you please make sure that you turn off any devices that you might have with you this evening? Give you a second to do that in case you haven't done it. Thank you. In January 2016, Pope Francis gave his first ever interview on China and the Chinese people to Asia Times columnist and China Renmin University senior researcher Francesco Sisi. Pope Francis talked about what he has learned from the 17th century Jesuit missionary to China, Matteo Ricci, who said, Ricci's experience teaches us that it is necessary to enter into dialogue with China because it is an accumulation of wisdom and history. It is a land blessed with many things. And it is obvious, he says, that so much culture and so much wisdom, and in addition, so much technical knowledge, cannot remain enclosed within a country. They tend to expand, to spread, to communicate. As China emerges from its own environment and is opening to the world, this creates unprecedented challenges for China and for the world. Pope Francis's perspective is that we should not be fearful of such a situation. Instead, he says the history of a people is always a path. When a people moves forward, this does not worry me because it means they are making history. And I believe that the Chinese people are moving forward, and this is their greatness. China walks, like all populations, through lights and shadows. And so how should we relate to China in this emerging situation? He says the Western world, the Eastern world, and China all have the capacity to maintain the balance of peace and the strength to do so. We must find the way, always through dialogue. Encounter is achieved through dialogue. The true balance of peace is realized through dialogue. If we are to enter into such dialogue honestly and authentically, it is necessary for us to have a critical understanding of China today and of Canada's foreign policy. And so this evening we are honored to have with us Mr. David Mulroney, President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto, to help us think about the kind of vision for the world that Canada needs right now, especially in its relationship to China. Mr. Mulroney came to St. Michael's after more than 30 years in Canada's public service. A career Foreign Service officer, Mr. Mulroney was Canada's ambassador to the People's Republic of China from 2009 to 2012. His book about Canada-China relations, wonderful book, Middle Power, Middle Kingdom, What Canadians Need to Know About China in the 21st Century, was published last year by Penguin Canada. Prior to his appointment in Beijing, Mr. Mulroney was assigned to the Privy Council office in Ottawa as the Deputy Minister responsible for the Afghanistan Task Force, overseeing coordination of all aspects of Canada's future role in Afghanistan, known as the Manley Panel. Mr. Mulroney's other assignments included serving as Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and concurrently as the Prime Minister's personal representative to the G8 Summit. Mr. Mulroney is a distinguished senior fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs, a distinguished fellow of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and an honorary fellow of the University of St. Michael's College. He is also a recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, the University of Toronto's Arbor Award, and in June 2015, he received an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from Western University. Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Mulroney to speak to us on the topic, Living with the Dragon.
Thank you kindly, Christina, and many thanks to you and to Father Ron for your wonderful work in organizing this seminar and helping to make it possible. We had the opportunity, Father Ron and I spoke at Scarborough Foreign Missions last night, which was wonderful for me because of their history in China, and to be with some of the members of the order and to be in their storied chapel from which so many great Canadians departed to serve in the China missions was really inspirational. It was also useful because I was able to recall what happened last night, and if there was any portion where I saw someone falling asleep or walking out outraged, throwing fruit, I took that section out of the speech. So I've got about a 2-minute text for tonight. So that was wonderful. And let me also thank President Catherine Bergman, who is my colleague, my esteemed colleague, someone who works in the higher education sector and in that very special subset of it, Catholic higher education. And she's someone I admire, and it's wonderful to be with her on this very lively and inspiring campus. I also just wanted to note that it's wonderful to have my wife Janet with me, because the talk was the cause, unfortunately, of a little bit of a spousal miscommunication, because Janet was helping clean up my always messy desk at home and found a document titled Living with the Dragon. And I think she may have thought it was the title of my tell-all book about our marriage. And I have some explaining to do tonight, so I hope she listens attentively. So it's wonderful to have this opportunity to share my thinking, my ever thinking about Canada-China relations, a topic that's dear to my heart and one that was central to my professional life. I don't claim to be a China hand, much less a sinologist. I found that any association with China tends to get you more credit than is your due. People outside of China tend to see it as a distant, exotic, and somewhat inaccessible library. And they assume that anyone who's actually found that library and made it past the imposing doors must have mastered every book on its numberless shelves. I have spent a lot of time in the wonderful library that is modern China, but I feel that I've barely made it out of the extensive section devoted to new readers. But before anybody asks for his or her money back, let me assure you that I've spent more than 30 years thinking about a tiny subset of that much larger issue, specifically Canada's relationship with China. The reemergence of China has been the central foreign policy development of my career, and I was lucky enough to experience some of its more dramatic chapters. It's actually hard for me to connect the China that I first experienced as a newly minted Foreign Service officer with the place I retired from many years later. Setting up operations in China was, in the early 1980s, something of an achievement. I remember being awed back then to receive telexes, and we always communicated by telex, from a Canadian business person operating from an office in the Beijing hotel, who ended his messages with the postscript, "Alone in China." It wasn't true even then, but it certainly impressed my neophyte self. The Shanghai that I worked in 30 years ago was a drab, soot-covered shadow of its 1930s Art Deco heyday. It was so untouched by time that Steven Spielberg filmed his World War II epic, Empire of the Sun, without masking anything of the city's downtown. I'm very familiar with the film because Janet appears in it as an extra, and that magical moment 18 minutes in when she hails a taxi still commands family attention whenever it's shown on TV. That was then. I ended my government career in 2012 in a China that was, by that time, far and away the world's second largest economy. A China of high-speed trains, futuristic airports, and luxury cars. And a China in which the ubiquity of Microsoft, McDonald's, and Marriott had long since ceased to be newsworthy. The last 3 decades have seen China transform itself from being a closed-off and backward place struggling to emerge from the trauma of the Cultural Revolution to its current status as a challenger to the United States for global hegemony. It's an evolution that has been increasingly consequential for China's neighbors, Canada included. Indeed, I would argue that China's rise brings with it the dawn of a new era in Canada's international relations, requiring of us a new kind of diplomacy. We need to embrace, and sooner rather than later, what I would describe as a grown-up approach to foreign policy, a more sophisticated management of our interests in a changing world, a world in which China is increasingly important. This is a timely topic in a year that has seen back-to-back leader-level visits between Canada and China. The hope has been expressed on both sides of the Pacific that Justin Trudeau will be able to channel some of his father's vision and purpose so as to usher in a new golden age in Canada-China relations. I want to talk about whether that hope is realistic or, as currently imagined, even desirable. And while I'm at it, I want to get personal, sharing some of my experiences as a Canadian diplomat and as a religious believer, a Catholic in modern China. That's timely, too, because the Church is engaged in the latest chapter of a long negotiation with China's communist rulers, hoping to reverse a pattern that has to date offered 2 steps back for everyone forward when it comes to being allowed to fulfill its mission freely and faithfully. And it's timely, too, because religious freedom is part of a larger current in Canada-China relations, human rights. I want to explore the question of whether human rights should be a priority on the bilateral agenda, and whether Canada has a role in promoting religious freedom for China's Catholics, Muslims, and Buddhists. I've said that I want to make the case for the rise of China ushering in a new normal in Canadian foreign policy. Up until very recently, we've enjoyed the luxury of having the most important questions that a foreign policy is designed to safeguard, our prosperity and our security, comfortably embedded within the context of our relationship with the United States. And although the recent election has given us all at least some cause for concern, I think we can agree that Canada has flourished under the Pax Americana that has prevailed since the end of the Second World War. Like the person who was born on third base and grew up thinking he'd hit a triple, our geographical advantage has allowed us to believe that we occupy an exalted status, one in which how and when we engage the rest of the world, the non-US part of it, is entirely up to us. We haven't attached much importance to cultivating long-term relationships with other countries, particularly other countries that aren't like us. Who Canada is friends with tends to be dictated by the vagaries of the Prime Minister's travel schedule. For most countries, it's the other way around. Foreign engagements are strategic. This aversion to strategic thinking has resulted in an inconsistent, will-o'-the-wisp approach to our relationship with other countries. Japan is a priority one year, India the next, and the Americas the year after that. This tendency to dabble abroad has been exacerbated by 2 unfortunate distractions. The first is a rather well-developed sense of self-regard, typified in the assertion that the world needs more Canada. Lost in this is the sense that we might need other countries, or that other countries might have their very own plans for us. An Australian ambassador once said that although his country didn't have a China strategy, China almost certainly had an Australia strategy. It almost certainly has a Canada strategy too. The second distraction is the steady encroachment of the 24/7 election cycle, the relentless politicization of governance, a process through which international relations becomes an exotic extension of Canadian politics. Foreign policy is reduced to foreign travel, which is reduced to foreign photo ops, reflecting back to us a reassuring impression of how worldly and tolerant we are. As tempting as it can be to replace a telescope with a mirror, there are trends out there worthy of our careful attention, and China is the source of many of these. Much of my recent book on Canada-China relations is about how the rise of China is reverberating across Canadian society, from how homes are bought and sold in Vancouver to how lobsters are marketed in Nova Scotia, from China's public diplomacy in Canada, think of Confucius Institutes and cuddly pandas, we've just been discussing cuddly pandas at dinner, to clandestine efforts to intimidate Canadians to shut down voices here in Canada that China considers problematic. We should be paying careful attention now more than ever, and we're not. We should be paying careful attention because current trends point to a China that will be even more influential, assertive, and unpredictable in years ahead. China certainly continues to defy expectations. If you'd polled China watchers 10 years ago, the majority would have said that governance in China was following a peaceful and promising trajectory, a reassuring path from rule by a single leader, Mao Zedong, to rule by a consensus among an ever-growing collection of senior leaders and advisors. If democracy wasn't in the wings, at least we could expect higher degrees of balance, prudence, and predictability as more constituencies were heard from. But the steady ascendancy of President and party leader Xi Jinping has confounded these expectations. Let me be clear, we're not returning to the Mao Zedong era. Xi is not attempting to bolster his leadership through a cult of personality. That said, he has made it increasingly clear that he is more than a first among equals in the Chinese system. He has steadily seized control of all the levers of power, including power over the military and the security apparatus. He has, through an ambitious and ominously enduring campaign against corruption, which is eliminating more than a few troublesome rivals in the process, signaled that no one, no matter how senior, can safely defy him. Indeed, the Central Committee of the party last month dusted off the rarely used epithet of core leader and bestowed it on Xi. This matters immensely because Xi's centralization of power imperils efforts to build into China's governance mechanisms for a predictable and orderly transfer of power. A big part of such a system is premised, at least in China, on the confidence that a leader can step down without worrying whether his supporters will be purged and imprisoned arbitrarily, or even legitimately, by the next regime. Many, myself included, worry that Xi has let that particular genie back out of the bottle. When it comes to succession in China, all bets are off. It's important here to think carefully about what appears to be motivating Xi. And let me assure you that I will only briefly don the mantle of pop psychologist. While a personal agenda, aspired by a desire for wealth or power, can never be ruled out, I would argue that Xi's true motivation is more strategic and political. Almost everything he's done, from suppressing freedom of religion and freedom of speech to attacking corruption, has had as its objective reinforcing the power and authority of China's Communist Party, ensuring that it is widely supported as the only legitimate option for the long-term governance of China. Now, and this is where pop psychology comes in, this seems very strange from someone like Xi, whose own father was broken and destroyed by the party during the Cultural Revolution, and given the fact that Xi was himself banished to the countryside at that time. I think these experiences have instilled in Xi a stark, binary view of China's possibilities. You can have the party or you can have brutal chaos. Put another way, it's better to be within the party's tent than wandering in the wilderness outside of it. Xi Jinping is the ultimate party man. He has tapped into Chinese nationalism, a fiery source of political energy that the Communist Party carefully tends and selectively stokes, and his public humiliation of corrupt officials, from the most senior, called tigers, to the very modest, dubbed flies, is also hugely popular. This is all the more compelling because Xi manages to convey the image, an accurate one I think, of personal probity and plain living. This has allowed him to assume easily and comfortably the homey nickname of Xi Dada, Uncle Xi. If not beloved, then at least admired by China's Laobaixing, the old 100 names, the regular Joes. The result of all this activity, Xi's infectious patriotism and his bracing call to rectitude, is a sort of suspended sentence, the postponement of the party's inevitable rendezvous with history. Tapping into nationalism and nostalgia, including the selective deployment of Mao's complicated legacy, provides much of the necessary energy to carry off Xi's complicated and ambitious agenda. It helps to sustain an assertive foreign policy, provides a rationale for stifling dissent, and offers a distraction for less than spectacular economic performance. Above all, it offers a justification for continuing rule by the Communist Party, the party of Mao Zedong, which is a central objective of Xi Jinping's leadership. Accepting this explains many characteristics of his era, among them a less ambitious commitment to economic reform. Unlike his predecessors, Xi is not about to cede more authority to market forces. This is true even though reformers like Xi's own premier, Li Keqiang, have argued that liberalization of the economy is the key to reigniting growth. That may be, but the priority for Xi is ensuring that the party retains control of all the levers of power. This also explains the longevity and ferocity of the anti-corruption campaign, reflecting Xi's accurate assessment that public resentment of corrupt officials is a grave and continuing threat to the party's continuing rule. and it provides the rationale for Xi's relentless efforts to root out so-called Western influences in the media and academia, and his implacable desire not just to control, but to sinicize religious belief, to make it more Chinese, more susceptible to the party's guiding hand. So how's Xi doing? It depends, as everything in China depends, on your perspective. In the short term, he looks pretty good. He remains popular despite a slowing economy, and China continues to consolidate, if not expand, its regional and global influence. Longer term, the picture is less bright. Pessimists believe that Xi's back-to-the-future approach to governance suggests that he will not go quietly into retirement at the end of his second five-year term, and that's 2022, 2023. And then he'll find some means of retaining continuing control. But if Xi does this, he's taking a major risk. Not only does he provide a compelling agenda for his own rivals, who could describe themselves as patriotic reformers, but it also points China into an uncertain and potentially dangerous future. In a system that is increasingly predictable and governed by traditions, if not rules, there's reason to hope that the country is embarked on a long, careful process of evolution and reform. Abandoning that path casts a shadow over hopes for progress in governance and gives ambitious and unprincipled people throughout the system cover to undo the many small initiatives, the grassroots experiments that build into larger systemic change. That's bad in itself and fatal for the party. It is evident that we've come to the end of a great and long experiment, launched in the chaos and uncertainty that followed the Tiananmen massacre, in which the party bought stability through economic growth and rising expectations. The deal was, we will not democratize. We're not going to have multi-party democracy. This is something that Deng Xiaoping, the leader at the time, felt very strongly about, but we will grow the economy. You will be able to expect that you can own your apartment, you can send your child to university, you can have a better life. So we'll manage government, and you can have a steadily increasing standard of living. Even modest efforts at democratization were put on hold as the economy grew at breakneck speed. We're just past the end of 30 years in which the Chinese economy grew at more than 10% a year. Reform, such as it was restricted to making the party more corporate, less of a one-man show. Now, even this appears to be on hold. It worked for almost 20 years, but slowing growth and rising corruption emboldened people to question the status quo. Their skepticism was enabled through the increasing internationalization of Chinese society as more people traveled, and they are traveling, and facilitated through new technologies, most notably social media. Xi's mix of patriotism and pragmatism has given the party a reprieve. He's gambling, doubling down on patriotism rather than reform, hoping that he can convince China's people that perpetual rule by the party is both inevitable and desirable. The Chinese Communist Party is a remarkably adaptive organization, but it is burdened by its own history of extreme violence and repression, and it is highly resistant to the kind of openness that is increasingly expected by modern societies. Whether it has the ability to meet looming challenges posed by environmental degradation and a stalled economic reform program, just as the bill comes due for decades of ruthless demographic experimentation through the one-child policy, is a question that is being posed with increasing urgency. My own sense is that given China's resilience, depth of talent, and inherent dynamism, it will find a way to muddle through, but at the cost of stability and predictability at home and in its foreign relations. China is not about to implode or fracture, but we should all be prepared for a bumpy ride. This means that, for the foreseeable future, we will have to deal with the deeply flawed entity that is the party, architect of China's resurgence and architect of some of its darkest and bloodiest experiences. But even as we continue to find a modus vivendi with the party, we must also be open to what I think of as China's constituencies of change. The journalists who want to be fearless reporters, the teachers and writers who want to dedicate themselves to the truth, and the activists who dare to dream of a better future. I believe that our number one foreign policy challenge is figuring out how to share the planet with a China that is home to many contradictions, that has always been home to contradictions, We need to navigate our Canadian future alongside a China that is assertive and insecure. It prides itself on being the Middle Kingdom, but complains about being banished to the peripheries. That vaunts its culture, ancient and modern, and imprisons its artists and scholars. That preaches the gospel of non-interference and interferes relentlessly in its own neighborhood, and, as Canadians are increasingly aware, far beyond. So how should the Canada of the second Trudeau era respond to this bundle of contradictions? We should start by seeing China as it is. For too long, we have tended to vacillate between two extreme positions. The first, and in many ways the hardiest and most enduring of these, is to see China as a Canadian project, a country that can, with the right amount of help and encouragement, become just like us. The most modern manifestation of this tendency, at once generous and naive, is strongly associated with the Liberal Party of Canada and is rooted in the 1960s and 1970s, in what we might call the recognition era. That's when intellectuals in the West believed in the emergence of the new China, presided over by a storied communist party led by Mao Zedong, still seen by many as a wily and engaging peasant philosopher. Canadians in the recognition era saw themselves as having a lead role in helping to construct that China, the one that Mao promised. And we did indeed make major contributions, particularly in the field of higher education. The reemergence of China's universities and the growth of new universities is due in many ways to the help extended through the Canadian government and by Canadian universities and Canadian academics. The notion that we should partner with the Communist Party in overseeing China's steady transformation into a like-minded major power even survived Tiananmen in 1989. As recently as the 2000s, the Liberal Party was considering establishing the kind of party-to-party relations with the Communist Party of China that they have with America's Democrats. This naive optimism lives on into the present. It surfaced during the Prime Minister's recent visit when he suggested that we could help China position itself on the world stage, as if helping Canada position itself on the world stage isn't job enough. This plays to our vanity, to our "the world needs more Canada" complex, and it plays to our tendency to see the China that we want to see, rather than the far more complicated China that's out there before our eyes. But a very different view of China has also held sway in large parts of Canada, off and on, since the creation of the People's Republic in 1949, particularly among members of the Conservative Party of Canada. China, in this conception, isn't so much a promising work in progress as it is a relentlessly antagonistic and dangerous outlier. Not our golden future, but the sum of all fears. This was the view of the Harper government for a significant portion of its time in power. That stubborn conviction, coupled with the Conservatives' tremendous impatience with traditional diplomacy, rendered them unable to understand what their Chinese interlocutors were telling them or to communicate effectively in return. If the Liberals tended to ignore the significant negatives associated with the Communist Party of China, that's all that the Conservatives tended to see. They also largely ignored the many avenues for cooperation with those constituencies of change that I talked about. And both the Liberals and Conservatives are hindered by their dedication to the 24/7 election campaign. Foreign policy is no longer seen as a responsibility entrusted to successive governments for their careful stewardship. It has become a political tool, part of the spoils of war won by the victorious party. No democratic government is immune from using foreign travel as an extension of domestic politics. But my sense is that recent Canadian governments have taken this to new depths. I talked in my book about seeing Canadian ministerial aides manhandling senior Chinese officials to set up a photo op. At other times, they were more hands-off, leaving senior Chinese guests in lonely isolation at banquets while they hustled the Prime Minister off to pose with long lines of Chinese and Canadian guests. The rhythms of our engagement with China have come to be determined by the vagaries of political polling in Canada. Governments now follow rather than lead public opinion on sensitive foreign policy questions. Governments absolutely should lead the people, but they should also talk to the people. They should encourage dialogue and debate about why it's important to engage China. In my final year in China, I came to the worrying conclusion that the government, at the political level, was behaving this way not because politicians didn't understand the cost to Canadian interests, but because they really didn't care. Short-term political advantage back home trumped and trumps, no pun intended, every other consideration. Canada tends to see the China of its fondest imaginings or worst fears, and it tends to engage China as an exotic extension of Canadian politics. This doesn't sound like a promising basis from which to embark on a new kind of foreign policy, one that sees Canada deftly navigating in a world in which we have many opportunities but fewer real friends, in which major emerging powers like China will choose to engage us regardless of whether we feel inclined to engage them. So what would a successful Canadian engagement of China look like? First, it would be launched in Canada. We need a serious public debate about why we need to engage China in the first place if we're to protect and promote our security, our prosperity, and our well-being. We need to convince Canadians that talking with China is not the same thing as agreeing with China, and at the same time remind Canadians that there are actually many voices in China with whom we might actually agree. We also need to reassure Canadians that despite China's size and growing power, we are still capable of managing disagreements and saying no. As China watcher James Fallows likes to say, and Pope Francis, we should respect China, but we shouldn't fear it. Second, we should invest in China competence. Here we can take a lesson from countries like Australia, New Zealand, and the US, where students are encouraged to study abroad, where priority is attached to learning Asian languages, starting with Chinese, and where there is growing recognition of the importance of ensuring that national cabinets and corporate boards are staffed with at least some people with experience of China. I arrived in China as ambassador in the fall of 2009, and Prime Minister Harper arrived just a few months after that. President Obama made his first trip to China at the same time. And this was a period when the Chinese were feeling their oats, and they unwisely, I think, treated President Obama with a lack of respect. They didn't think he was very strong, and so they didn't give him the kind of respect that a US president would normally get in China. So the visit was a bit of a bust, but for one thing. At the end of his visit, Obama used the bully pulpit of the presidency to speak directly to American students. And he said, there aren't many Americans studying in China right now. Over the next 4 years, I'd like to see 100,000 American students come and do some form of study in China. And they called it the 100,000 Strong Initiative. The State Department worked on it. The Asia Society in New York worked on it. State governments, universities, municipalities worked on it. And they reached that 100,000 mark well before the 4 years were up. And one of the things I think happened, and I had some experience because I did a project with the Asia Pacific Foundation where we looked at how many students are learning Chinese in Canada. It's a big step for students to take, and particularly the idea of going to China. They're leaving competitive programs. Their colleagues are moving ahead. They're doing something that's different and exotic. And I think the role of the president was almost to give them permission. They could say to their skeptical parents, or they could tell themselves, the president thinks this is a good idea. We need similar voices in Canada encouraging young Canadians to do something similar. So I think we need to invest in China competence. Third, we need to focus carefully and attach true priority to the relationship. Our mission in Afghanistan struggled until John Manley and his panel made the recommendation that we shift from having 100 or more priorities to having 4 or 5. Manley also made it clear that the mission was sufficiently important that it needed to be owned by the Prime Minister and directed by Cabinet. China is far more important than Afghanistan ever was to us. We need to attach even higher priority to our relationship with it. The Prime Minister, like his father, needs to take the lead here. And the first thing he should do is help us to focus not on 100 things, but on the 4 or 5 things that we absolutely need to get right. And what should these be? Canadian prosperity, our ability to create jobs and to invest in things like infrastructure, healthcare, schools, depends fundamentally on the health of our economy, and the health of our economy depends increasingly on the health of our trade relationship with China, the world's second largest economy. While China isn't nearly as important to us as the US is, it is far more important than any of our other partners. Our two-way trade relationship with China is now bigger than our two-way trade relationship with the UK, France, Germany, and Japan combined. And China, even though it's not growing as fast as it was, is still growing faster than those countries. China is also fundamental to our security. We have a stake in ensuring that China's continuing rise is peaceful and that it helps to maintain stability in East Asia. We need to hope that China, in the words of senior American official Robert Zoellick, becomes a responsible stakeholder. capable of constraining North Korea, and cooperating to combat terrorism and piracy. If we take a hard-nosed look at things, that's not the trajectory that China's on at the moment. China appears unwilling and or incapable of restraining North Korea. And if anything, its relentless assertiveness is destabilizing East and Southeast Asia. It's beginning to represent a challenge and threat to our closest ally, the United States. Indeed, we in Canada seem remarkably unconcerned that our most important and second most important trading partners are now locked in an increasingly tense standoff. That means that we have to invest more in traditional defense, not to mount a challenge to China, not for some bellicose reason, but to engage positively with the Chinese military on training and cooperation. We need to show that the Asia-Pacific region isn't simply a zone for Sino-American conflict, and that many countries, Canada included, share that space. We welcome China's rise, but we have expectations as to the role that China can and should play. We also have to admit that China poses a direct challenge to our security in terms of espionage, cyber as well as human, and in terms of interference in Canadian affairs, whether it be by attempting to silence critical voices, such as threatening mayors and local politicians if they do anything involving the Falun Gong, the Dalai Lama, or Tibet, or by intimidating Canadians of Chinese origin, particularly in the Tibetan and Muslim Uyghur communities. There is no escaping the fact that we need to do a better job detecting and deterring clandestine efforts by China to interfere in Canadian society. And simply being seen to be willing and able to make the effort is an important first step. That's why recently when Chinese hackers penetrated the National Research Council and Canada spoke up publicly, it was the right thing to do. Every now and then you have to make it clear that a line has been crossed. A third Canadian priority, by my accounting, would fall under the heading of what I call well-being. China is increasingly part of the problem and part of the solution when it comes to the environment, global health, and food safety. The road to global progress in each of these areas now necessarily passes through Beijing. I would round out my list with a fourth priority, establishing a full and effective program to address human rights. This should be an ambitious undertaking and include things like quiet diplomacy and public pressure, training and exchanges, collaboration and a division of labor with like-minded allies, and support for fledgling Chinese organizations. Now, suggesting that we make human rights a priority within the bilateral relationship is not without critics and controversy, in Canada as well as in China. Canadian critics, who can be very vociferous, cite two main reasons for not including human rights on our list. The first objection might best be described as the realist argument. Under this, critics argue that China is simply too big and too powerful to be approached, much less persuaded on this basis. They would argue that it is presumptuous to attempt to lecture, and it's always described as lecturing, a country with 30 times our population and whose problems are therefore 30 times as complex. The second objection is what I would call a relativist argument, in which it is argued that when Canadians invoke human rights, they are really only invoking Western values that are alien and inappropriate in a Chinese context. Both these arguments have merit, and both should be carefully considered. Indeed, the very real issues they raise for consideration immediately rule out any possibility that we can or should stand on our Canadian soapbox and lecture China. But there are powerful counter-arguments that are, in my view, ultimately more persuasive. They include the fact that a human rights engagement of China is no longer primarily focused in or on China. We need to understand that a confident and increasingly assertive China is taking the discussion beyond its borders into the international space. China's argument is that economic freedom is as important as political freedom and inevitably precedes it. This is an attractive argument in many parts of the developing world, particularly given the fact, amply borne out in China, that political freedom can be handily postponed for a future that never comes. So this is now a global debate, and one that we cannot afford to sit out or ignore. A second counter-argument is that it is false to suggest that calling for greater freedom and human rights betrays a Western perspective. Indeed, it is downright condescending to make such an argument. Recent Chinese history abounds with examples of champions of human freedom who made their arguments in Chinese terms and in a Chinese context. Indeed, the example of modern democratic Taiwan provides an instructive counterexample, as does the courageous umbrella movement for greater democracy in Hong Kong. There's a third reason why we need to include a discussion of human rights in our engagement of China, and that is because we live in a democracy, and the Canadian people expect that we necessarily talk about serious things with serious partners. This doesn't mean that we have to succumb to the unrealistic belief that we're going to help China become more like us. But it does mean that we're willing to reach out and engage and better understand those individuals and communities in China who are trying to effect positive change in Chinese terms. An effective human rights dialogue isn't about lecturing China or imposing a made-in-Canada solution on China. It is instead about listening, sharing, collaborating on ideas of mutual interest and mutual benefit, and in our modest, helpfully Canadian way, encouraging the emergence of Chinese ideas, of Chinese solutions. My favorite example of this approach was a program sponsored by the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, but eagerly, actively, and equally supported by partners in China, including the All China Women's Federation, local governments in Guangdong Province, even the Chinese Railway. The idea was to find ways to alert migrant workers to laws, policies, regulations, and resources that would protect them in a sometimes predatory working environment. This wasn't Canada standing on a soapbox and lecturing China. It was about Canada partnering with Chinese agencies to promote reforms that we all supported. We all wanted to help vulnerable migrant workers use the system to protect themselves from exploitation. The railway, for example, offered to provide brochures and information to passengers who might be at risk, typically young women traveling from the countryside to the big city. Now, while I want to make the case for taking on the realists and challenging the relativists, I do have to admit that my confidence was shaken by a penetrating critique that strikes hard at the very foundations on which my assumption is based. In a review of my book, Paul Evans, or professor at UBC, a highly respected authority on Canada and Asia, and a friendly antagonist, made the point that my perspective on China and human rights is that of a Catholic who believes in the universality of basic human rights, underpinned, as he points out, by a natural law tradition of thought. Guilty as charged. That's absolutely true, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But Evans is getting at something else with this argument. He argues, not without justification, that my particular take on things, my bias, he would say, leads me to invest too heavily in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, authored in 1945. I have institutional connections to two framers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One, John Peters Humphrey, was a Canadian public servant, which I once was. Another, Jacques Maritain, was closely associated with the University of St. Michael's College, where I currently work. The Canadian Public Service is deeply proud of Humphrey, but not being a particularly introspective organization, it doesn't spend much time thinking about the justification for the claim of universality. It basks in Humphrey's authorship of what Eleanor Roosevelt famously declared as the Magna Carta of mankind, but never asks to see his homework, how we make the case for universal human rights. Maritain's writings show his homework, how he makes the case that universal rights are both real and discernible. They allow us to fulfill our destinies as created beings. They allow us to become the people we were born to be. But he was also honest enough to concede that even 70 years ago, there was something less than unanimity around the question of universality. Careful negotiating and drafting, and the overwhelming dominance of the major Western powers, who were then less troubled about such claims, allowed the document to see the light of day. The then Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was a signatory. While the modern People's Republic has not repudiated the document, so they would say that they accede to the document, modern China is not inclined to acknowledge claims to universality. China also argues that any accession to greater rights is necessarily incremental and only follows economic development. It reminds me of that legendary sign, free beer tomorrow. Evans makes the point, and I think it's a valid one, that we would be unable to get anything like unanimity around a similar inventory of rights today. And if you read between the lines of his argument, he's pointing out that the problem isn't just with countries like China, it's with us too. If right and wrong are not based on what's written in our hearts, but what's in our heads, as fleeting and transitory and deeply personal as that might be, it's impossible to speak in universal terms. I had intimations of this while I was in government. At the start of my career, in far-off 1981, there was little daylight between what I believed as a Catholic and what amounted to what might be described as Canadian values. That wasn't true by the closing decade of my career. It wasn't entirely true. This didn't come to me through any dramatic revelation, but through smaller epiphanies, signs that I might be on what might be referred to as the wrong side of a growing ideological divide. I came to believe that on contentious issues like abortion, Canadian officials working at the multilateral level, at the UN and elsewhere, held views that were not only different from my own, but ideologically autonomous, resistant to evolution even in the wake of profound electoral change. I saw this firsthand when I served as Foreign and Defense Policy Advisor in the first year of the Harper government. This was and is a professional, nonpartisan appointment. I did it as a public servant. And my role was not to promote a particular policy position, but simply to ensure that there was complete transparency on policy issues, including policy issues at the UN. I can recall trying to clarify for the new government Canada's position under the heading of reproductive rights. And this concerned itself with things like access to contraception and abortion. It was very difficult to get any information. Officials stalled and temporized, and largely because I came to believe they didn't want to open up processes and decision points that they felt might be threatened by the political agenda of the new government. They seemed to identify more clearly with like-minded colleagues in other Western delegations. Indeed, if anything could be described as the imposition of Western values, this seemed to be it. This troubled me for two reasons. First, it seemed to me a failure of the democratic values of which the public service is justifiably proud. We do our jobs, but we serve the governments that Canadians elect. Second, it pointed to the fact that I was becoming something of an outlier in my own public service community. This growing divide, separating me from those who continued to be my respected professional colleagues, became apparent in other ways. When I later served as ambassador in China, I was on one occasion asked to sign off on a project sponsored by CEDA. The project involved providing business training and skills development for what were described as sex workers in ethnic Tibetan communities. The idea was to make them better at their jobs and therefore safer. I felt that the project was deeply flawed and wrong. I didn't believe for a moment that Tibetan women living in hardscrabble communities on the stony plateaus of southwest China somehow selected this dehumanizing and perilous path. I argued that Canada was wealthy enough and CEDA capable enough to offer training in alternative livelihoods so that these women wouldn't have to sell themselves to feed their families. CEDA's proposal sounded like a flawed, made-in-Canada interpretation of a very real Tibetan tragedy. It was quite the opposite of the migrant worker project I described a few minutes ago. I said that I was unable to approve the project. Although I had been told that my agreement was essential, CEDA found a workaround and the project went forward. That brought my lifetime record of policy disagreements with CEDA to a respectable 0-38. While I was in China, the Conservative government also announced its intention to name an ambassador for religious freedom. I welcomed this idea, but I was concerned that the project might founder if the government succumbed to the temptation of politicizing the office, a charge of which I can't completely acquit them. But the reaction within the Department of Foreign Affairs was different. Many colleagues complained, asking not rhetorically, if the government was also going to name an ambassador for atheism. It was clear that many of my colleagues saw this initiative as unfairly favoring religious believers, as if protecting them from persecution was a plum that would have to be balanced with some equally gratuitous gesture to other groups. It was as if freedom of religion wasn't under threat, as if it wasn't particularly important. But I saw it under threat daily in China, and as a Catholic, I felt it. It hurt to see the church constrained and under siege. I tried to channel that personal distress into a more general inclination to do my best to support religious freedom writ large across China, and in relation to any and all believers. This impulse was allied to my broader fascination with religious faith in China, a country with a rich array of beliefs and believers. So when I was finally granted permission to travel to Lhasa, I fought to see something of Tibetan Buddhism, battling with Chinese officials who would otherwise have filled my program with happy-talking proponents of the regime. On a trip to Yunnan in the southwest, I was able to sneak into a Protestant house church, something that would have been impossible in Beijing, where such places are ringed by security officials. I spent a couple of hours in a sunny courtyard listening to elderly people from one of China's many minority cultures sing hymns and read their Bibles. In Xinjiang, in the far west, I resorted to more subterfuge, slipping away to visit Muslim communities and believers, and in one case, finding myself followed by a carload of burly security officials. I was keenly interested in what I saw and often reported my experiences on social media. This in turn generated interesting responses and queries. Some of my reports sometimes elicited expressions of deep anxiety about Islam in general and Muslim Uyghurs in particular, something I tried to deflect by underlining, as a friendly outsider, my keen interest in China's rich mix of cultures. The Catholic China of my Beijing days was very different from the struggling, re-emerging church that I knew in Shanghai in the 1980s. The church was growing, albeit not as quickly as Protestant denominations, but it was benefiting from a wise and generous overture that Pope Benedict had initiated through a wonderful 2007 letter to the Chinese faithful, all of them. In it, Benedict attempted to collapse the walls separating the state church from the underground church, recognizing that there were faithful believers on both sides, and creating space and conditions for new growth. And the church worked behind the scenes, allowing for the ordination of bishops who, while unobjectionable to the government, were also clearly loyal to Rome. But that Catholic spring was short-lived. By 2009, when I returned to Beijing, China was basking in the glow of praise for its dynamic economic model. Assertiveness was the order of the day, and compromise far less necessary. Positive overtures to the church were reversed, and officials were once again aggressively bending the church to the party's will, in some cases frog-marching elderly priests and bishops to rigged meetings, and insisting that only a national church, and one clearly subservient to the party, would be tolerated. I was struck by the reemergence of old and absurd fears. I recall hearing the foreign minister, a senior official in a nuclear-armed state, spit out in rage the three syllables Bandigang, the Chinese name for a tiny and far-off Roman enclave, the Vatican. I was forced to endure a finger-wagging lecture by a junior official sent to meet me on my arrival in a city that was home to an important Catholic seminary, one that I was scheduled to visit. He insisted, out of the blue, that I depart immediately for an urgent call on a senior official. I argued that we could still find time for my seminary visit, which we did, with me, the party official, priests and seminarians proceeding at a jog trot through the halls of the building. We'd baked some cookies for the seminarians, and as I ran along, I would toss them out. And years later, I met a priest from that seminary, and he said, "We remember those cookies. They were good. Broken, but good." And the urgent meeting I was called to turned out to be bogus. It was in this atmosphere that I had a series of conversations with an American priest, one I first met in Taiwan. At his prompting, I joined with fellow Catholics in the Canadian Embassy to help set up and support a regular Sunday Mass for the international community. We could offer a secure and predictable location, a place not subject to sudden cancellation, as other liturgies organized at hotels and community centers often were. We also offered our space to other religious believers from other faiths in the broader international community, but with no takers. They didn't face the particular challenges Catholics faced at that time. Within a few weeks, we were welcoming hundreds to Sunday Mass in the embassy's Alvin Hamilton room. People from every corner of the world but one. We were unable to offer access to Chinese citizens. I could not and would not, as ambassador, break the law, even one I deplored. Not only would this have triggered a Chinese reaction against the event and the celebrant, it would have been a betrayal of the trust that my government had placed in me. I deeply regretted not being able to respond to requests to include Chinese friends. I hope that some spark of belief might be kindled in the hearts of those watching us gather for Mass or waving our palms in procession on the Sunday before Easter. And I like to think that I saw this spark inflame the heart of at least one watcher. Those Sunday mornings were marked by great happiness and contentment. I often felt, at the end of my career in a wonderful, entirely secular organization, that my professional life and my personal life were coming together, that in a sense I was coming home. We hear that the Vatican and China are again attempting rapprochement. I'm convinced that the senior leadership of the Communist Party is incapable of understanding a religious perspective, and that they deeply fear religions, particularly those like Catholicism, Islam, and Tibetan Buddhism, that cannot fit snugly under the flag of a single state. I also think that any seeming accommodation offered to the Vatican by China's communist leaders will be less than meets the eye. But despite this, I think the effort worthwhile. God works in mysterious ways, and the Church, where it is allowed to exist, has a way of surviving and eventually undermining even the most determined opposition. I'm less hopeful when it comes to maintaining a sustained and fruitful bilateral dialogue with China on human rights. For one thing, there isn't much of a Western alliance to count on. When I was in Beijing, our major European allies we're often content to leave such heavy lifting to the EU. So rather than having a French diplomat or a British diplomat or a Dutch diplomat, we'd have the more general representative of the EU. So other countries didn't have to risk their names and risk Chinese anger. For her part, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, assured the Chinese that discussions of human rights would not be allowed to derail the larger bilateral agenda. The result was predictably disastrous, with an emboldened China assuming that the US had lost its nerve. I won't speculate on whether the Chinese can expect to receive any lectures about human rights from Donald Trump. And as I've indicated, I think it is increasingly difficult for Western governments, Canada's included, to present a coherent and foundationally sound argument for the universality of human rights. This makes us disinclined to call attention to a level of sex-selective abortion that is skewing demographic trends. It makes us disinclined to talk about the use of capital punishment as a form of social control, and we're unlikely to mention China's disquieting tolerance for reckless, unregulated genetic experimentation. I do think that the agenda of topics that we're willing to address with China is shrinking along the lines that Paul Evans suggests. He gets specific in his own Canada-China book, pointing to where Canadians are likely to end up. Some, he suggests, want to talk about social issues, including abortion, religious freedom, the one-child policy, capital punishment. But for most, he argues, the concern is with the political system, corruption, rule by the Communist Party, limited respect for the basic political rights of free speech and assembly. The problem is that even this more limited inventory remains somewhat tentative and vulnerable to the relativist critique if it isn't grounded in belief in the ultimate worth and dignity of the people such reforms are designed to protect. If we lose touch with our long-standing and once unshakable conviction that human life is sacred and inviolable, if we're unable or unwilling to articulate why religious freedom should be available to everybody and not just those lucky enough to be born here in the West, our own agenda becomes untethered and conditional, more a matter of party politics than of underlying and unchanging beliefs. We're against the death penalty until we're for it, sort of. But I'm not completely without hope. I've spoken of constituencies of change in China, of lawyers who want to advance the rule of law, of journalists who want to report the truth, and of religious believers who offer a perspective that transcends an increasingly dreary materialist culture. And just as there are constituencies of change worthy of support in China, so too do such constituencies exist in Canada. Could it be that the truly important discussions about human rights need to be held at a subnational level, by groups of concerned Canadians, by lawyers who are deeply committed to the rule of law for everyone, by journalists who value fearless reporting everywhere, and by religious believers who are bold enough and brave enough to assert that we are, Chinese and Canadians, all God's children. Thank you. Sure.
So we have 4 microphones available for you, and Mr. Mulroney is happy to take questions, and so we can begin some conversation. Lots to think about. I'll let you.
Sure. Can everyone hear this gentleman? Great.
Ask you that dealt with China or considered whether it's pessimism of the now, given the first year of the current situation, now that we're post-American election, current liberal government a little bit more pragmatic towards China, or do you see it naive former liberal government?
Sure. I think I can understand to a certain extent why we have these two extremes, because China presents both faces. China is an exciting place, and it's a place that you can't help but be inspired by and spend any time in China, every now and then you do think you've had a glimpse of the future. It's a remarkable place. But it's also a place that is disturbing, disquieting, increasingly assertive. So the challenge for us is to understand that it's both. It's not either or, it's both. And we've never really had to address a country like that, to deal with a country like that. The Soviet Union was a big, powerful country, but it wasn't an economic powerhouse. We weren't buying, we bought some Ladas, but we didn't buy a lot of things from the Soviet Union. We buy everything that China has to offer. We borrow money from China. So it's a much more complicated relationship for us. The other thing is, and we're not used to this, and this is why I talk about a grown-up foreign policy, our international future, the world we're sailing into, isn't necessarily a good news story. The good news, we're coming to the end of the good news story, and that's this Pax Americana where, regardless of your views, the United States, an engaged United States, has basically guaranteed global stability. And God knows we've seen lots of local wars, but global stability since the end of the Second World War. So the challenge for the Trudeau government is to deal with this China that is a bit of both. I think they are probably a little bit more pragmatic than we've seen in the past, and that we were certainly witnessing at the end of the Chrétien and the Martin years. But I don't think they're totally pragmatic. And this comment that maybe we can help China find its place in the world stage, that's sort of an absurd comment. So I think that they still have a little bit of balancing to do. The other thing is, like the Conservatives, they watch the polls very carefully. And Canadians are ambivalent. And Canadians have good reason to be ambivalent. They're not sure about China. They don't like China. If you look at the polling, what countries do you feel warm to? What countries do you feel cool towards? China's often on the cool list because China doesn't present a very welcoming face to the world most of the time. So they're going to have their hands full finding this way forward. I think the current Prime Minister is very well equipped to start this conversation with Canadian people. And again, it's not an entirely happy conversation. The world is changing. We need to manage our destiny in ways that we haven't managed it before. But the good news is we're pretty good at it. If you look at the history of Canada and China, we've basically ended up we've got a great reputation there. We've done many of the right things. We're good when we actually decide to engage internationally. We're pretty good at it. We're good negotiators. We just have to have the courage and energy to do that. I haven't seen all the signs that I'd like to see from the new government that that's the way they're going, but that's the way they could go. We don't know yet, so we can remain hopeful.
He concludes, there's no such thing as human rights. Human rights are fiction. It's a fiction of our imagination. We say human rights is based on a faith, based on our belief in God and belief that God created us in a very special way. Therefore, results come from that. Is there any hope that a party like the Communist Party or other political movements that are not based on faith will ever adhere to human rights as we understand them? Because there's no foundation for it. Is there any possibility to be optimistic about that?
I spent the summer reading 3 books by a Dutch historian called Frank Dikötter. And Dikötter has written what he calls 3 popular histories of periods in China's recent past. One of them is what they call liberation. So it's the China that emerges in 1949, the new China. And it involves how the communists established control over the country. The second book is about what's called the Great Leap Forward, which was the disastrous economic experimentation at the end of the 1950s, where China under Mao said, just as Russia will overtake the United States as an economic power, we will overtake Britain in 10 years. We'll produce more steel, and it ushered in a period of chaos. And the third book is about the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. What's really shocking about the book is the extent to which is how cold-hearted the regime was. It likes to present itself as caring for the Chinese people, but Mao would say things like, well, there's going to be a lot of opposition in that province, so I think executing 1% of the people, you're probably going to get it right, but if you have to go higher, executing 2 or 3% might be necessary. This is at a time when China's population was about 650 million people. So tens of millions of people died at liberation, far more died in the Great Leap Forward, fewer died in the Cultural Revolution, but a lot died. So the history of the great challenge that China has is that the party that perpetrated all of that perpetrated these incredible outrages, these horrible, horrible regimes, it has tried to rehabilitate itself, but it's still the same Communist Party. I think they are more humane than they were in the past, but I think at the end of the day, they see individuals as economic units, not as anything more than that. So my optimism would be limited, but for the fact that I think what humanizes governments is effective democratization. So they will be held accountable to the extent to which the Chinese people hold them accountable. And that's the only constraint on their power. The great debate in China right now is the party subject to the rule of law, which I think it should be, or is the party the font of the law? So the party's above the law, it creates the law, and it can decide what the law is at any one time. So there's a radical disconnect between the party and the fundamental interests of the Chinese people. So I think the best you can get from a regime, like a reformed communist regime, is greater consideration for the people out of some kind of democratic impulse. I think the challenge the party has, though, and I think it may be past the point of no return, relates to some work that a good friend of mine at U of T, Professor Joe Wong, is doing, and that is looking at totalitarian states that decide that time is running out and they have to hand over power. So how can a totalitarian state hand over power in ways that don't create implosion, civil war, and their own demise? And Wong's analysis is they have to do it sooner rather than later, and with some urgency and dispatch. The irony is that before Tiananmen, the people were thinking about these things. This was at least a possibility. And the instability of Tiananmen closed the door on that. So I don't think the Chinese government can reform in the ways that we might hope. I think it can be fairer and better, and I think it is probably fairer and better than it has been in the past. But I don't know whether the Chinese people will give them that long-term lease on power. And the real tragedy is they have done nothing to prepare the way for a stable or orderly democratic succession. That's why I think China is going to, if anything, be more unpredictable, and the ride will be bumpier going forward.
Great, thanks, Ambassador Mulroney, for that wonderful and very wide-ranging talk. The one subject that you didn't touch on as much in the talk tonight, you spent a chapter on in the book, is looking at climate change. And I wonder if you can share some of your thoughts. At the time that you wrote your book, of course, we had the Harper government still in, which could be seen, or as, and you certainly cast, I think, appropriately, as a government that wasn't entirely encouraging internationally to deal with mitigation of global climate change. We now have a government that seems much more open, that seemed allied with the Obama administration to pursue this globally. I wonder, in light of a Trump presidency, climate change deniers entering into the fold, what space you see for a middle power like Canada to engage with a global power like China? And then you mentioned in your book as well, we need to think more carefully about how to encourage, empower, energize China's own diverse and often unrecognized environmental champions. I think that's a wonderful idea. What does that look like on a practical level, so it doesn't look like we are interfering in internal Chinese affairs, or that this is some sort of Western conspiracy, right? China has reassured us that Trump is wrong when he casts China as being the brainchild of global climate change to undermine American industry. They're obviously interested in projecting an image that they're seriously engaged. What does that, how can we enable that situation?
Well, first of all, one of the things that when I talk about the Chinese Communist Party as being adaptive, they monitor inflation, they're concerned about corruption and perceptions that the party is corrupt, and they're very worried about environmental degradation, which is shocking in China. So its air quality is terrible, although India now seems to be, Delhi is actually more polluted has more polluted air than Beijing. The soil is significantly polluted in many places, and water problems are just off the charts. In northern China, Beijing is a desert city. It's drier than cities in the Middle East. So China's environmental problems are legion, and they're of great concern to the party. It was positive and helpful to see the way that Obama and his Chinese counterparts kind of worked off one another. And they together moved forward through a degree of mutual trust. So that partnership now appears to be broken with the Trump presidency, and so that's discouraging. But remember that the Chinese government also has its own rationale for moving forward because their economic growth is unsustainable. It's environmentally unsustainable. So there's a very significant constituency in China that wants to see change. The other reason that China began to move was China prides itself on its position as a leader of the non-aligned and the developing world. And many countries, particularly Pacific Island states that are seeing water levels rise, suddenly realize, hey, the biggest emitter isn't the United States, it's China. So China was losing this mantle of, hero to the developing world, so that matters too. So I think China will still continue to move forward, but one of the three engines, and that is, continuing pressure and rivalry from the United States, is going to be missing. And that's no reason why Canada shouldn't make environmental issues a plank in our engagement of China and make sure that they're consulting carefully. The reference I had to empowering Chinese groups, I think, comes from an account, a really wonderful story about research done by an American organization called Panthera, which is designed to protect big cats, led by a fellow named George Schaller, who figures in a wonderful novel or a wonderful story by Peter Matheson called The Snow Leopard. And Schaller's experimentation in Tibet and the Tibetan portions of China showed that the snow leopard is safest and most protected in those regions where Tibetan Buddhism is strong, because Tibetan communities and lamas discourage Tibetan herdsmen from killing the snow leopards that might threaten their flocks. That they seem to be able to work and create a more harmonious zone in the areas around the lamassaries. And so NGOs are saying, how can we work with these communities to extend protection for the snow leopard? So the idea is there are all kinds of constituencies in China that are interested in environmental protection. I went at one point to a trade show in Beijing because we had some Canadians exhibiting there, and it was for outdoor equipment. And this happens in many sectors. 20 years ago, China was off the map. Now, this trade show has 3 places that it goes to annually, and one of them is Beijing. And it's, imagine many, many football fields of displays of mountaineering equipment and plaid shirts and down jackets. Young Chinese people are absolutely in love with the natural world. They want to go and hike and climb. They want to do that in Canada, but they also want to do it in China. There are all kinds of organizations. Now, you have to do it carefully. So anything involving Tibet is hugely controversial. But remember the story of Guangdong. There were people in Guangdong, even at the local government level. So China is not monolithic. Not everybody's a sort of a dictator trying to take your rights away. There are people who find themselves in government and actually want to do good. There are reporters who know what reporters do and want to do good. So it takes effort, and often it's helped if it's not the Canadian government, but maybe another Canadian organization, a university or an NGO. But that's absolutely one way of moving the ball forward. And we also learn things from our collaboration with the Chinese. So this is an area where I think we should be active. What I think we also have to realize, though, is it takes money, right? People often think about human rights as yelling at China and, did you chastise the Chinese leader? Sometimes you have to do that, but that's satisfying for about 5 minutes, and then they stop listening to you and they're not going to change anything. Human rights activism is also about empowering groups, spending money, training, university to university collaboration, and it's now more possible than ever because of all of these wonderful groups that are out there in China. They can't operate as freely as they'd like, but they can still do some things. Yes?
You had mentioned the Office of Religious Freedom, and I just wondered how closely were you able to work with Ambassador Bennett, and would it help the Canadian mission if its mandate had been continued?
I know Andrew Bennett quite well. Here's my take on things. As soon as it got up and running, we very quickly identified 3 or 4 projects with various religious groups in China. We did one with the major Protestant denomination. We had a couple of Buddhist projects. We had a Catholic project. And nothing nothing happened. The problem is that governments, and I think American public servants are going to find this out very quickly, governments that don't like government, governments that run against government, aren't very good at governing at that level. If you don't like the public service, you think public servants are basically leeches on the system or bumbling people who couldn't do things in the private sector or whatever, and you treat them with disrespect, you don't get very good performance. People internalize these beliefs. They become discouraged. And if you don't provide answers, if you don't work with the public service, respond to memos, allow public servants to approve projects, nothing gets done. So I think, and Andrew accomplished many good things and might disagree with me, but you can't just think up an idea like an Office of Religious Freedom and think it's going to happen. It's very complicated, and I don't think they did all the work that it takes to move from a policy idea to policy implementation. One of the things that I think and write a lot about is Afghanistan. So, the Martin government in 2004, 2005 says, we're going to go into Kandahar and we're going to go into the teeth of this Taliban insurgency, and we're going to deploy public servants and the military, and we're going to do all these great things, and we'll just scatter these pieces out there and they will assemble themselves and do those things. But nobody thought about how it was going to be implemented. How was it supposed to get done? And it wasn't until Manley and the panel, and they made their recommendations, that they actually began to think about the nitty-gritty of how does government work? How do you go from the idea to the conception, particularly in a very difficult environment? And I don't think that was done with the Office of Religious Freedom, because fundamentally the people who thought of it weren't all that interested in how it actually had to end up working. The Americans have had much more success with their office, but part of it is you have to empower the ambassador and trust him or her to work, and I don't think that ever happened. Yes?
Hello. Given that we seem to be coming to the end of nearly 100 years of American dominance as the sole superpower, and people are talking more about the rise of a multipolar world, China, Russia, India, and also given what you said about environmental problems hampering the rise of China, helping accelerate US decline, I'm curious about your view about the next 50, 100 years. Will China become the greatest power? Will it become a superpower? Or what will the world what will the world political stage look like in your view?
I'm glad you asked that, because I can tell you no. I wish. So I actually don't fundamentally believe that China will become the dominant power in the world. One, I think there's a lot of sort of resiliency in the United States. I'm a believer in the United States, even though, as Churchill said, Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. So, and I think he said that affectionately. So I think they may not be trying exactly the right thing right now, but I believe in the US system, and I think it's fundamentally got so much more energy, and because it's open to ideas, and I think that's true of the Canadian system too. So I think China's hampered in that respect. Second, China's challenges, environmental challenges, demographic challenges. So a couple of years ago, the Chinese workforce peaked. Now, the workforce is shrinking. People are getting older. You have the effects of the one-child family, so you have one person supporting many elderly relatives. I talked about the effects of sex-selective abortion. You have a significant statistically significant abundance of males, and you have the economy slowing. So China hasn't figured out, it might well, but it hasn't figured out how to move from being an export-oriented, powerhouse of the world to this next more sustainable stage of growth. And it doesn't have a political system that I think is resilient enough to get it there. And the final reason is I don't think China wants to be the global hegemon. It wants to be the regional hegemon. China wants and sees itself as being the dominant power in Asia, what it always was until the anomaly of the last couple of hundred years. So I think for all those reasons, China will be challenged by an imperfect and flawed political system and all these other things. I think it will muddle along, but it may be a little bit more like Russia is now, prickly, difficult to deal with, subject to factions and corruption. And I think we are moving into an inherently more unstable world. We're still very lucky because of the neighborhood we live in, but we're going to have to be much more alert and much more thoughtful in terms of how we engage that world. The good news is I think we're good at it, but we're going to have to take it very, very seriously. I was always encouraged when I was in China by the stories of Canadians in China that I'd come across. And of course, Bethune is very famous. And some people say, oh, the Chinese, Bethune is yesterday's man. No one in China, no. They like Bethune. They know Bethune. He's a great example of what the Chinese think of as a Canadian personality. In the weeks before we were leaving Beijing, Janet and I were rushing around trying to do all the things that we hadn't done in the years we were there. And one of the things, so I was writing reports and preparing to hand things over to my successor, and we were trying to put the dog in a crate and make sure he got to the right place. He did. And there were a couple of things we hadn't seen. And one of them was the site called Zhoukoudian. Zhoukoudian is the site where the Peking man discovery was made. And it's, as the name suggests, not too far from Peking. And so we set off and we left the tangle and the jumble of the suburbs of Peking. And we came into this beautiful leafy park with a road running straight through the park. And as we drove along, you could see pictures. And so I figured out these must be the pictures of the scientists who helped to make these discoveries in 1920, 21, and thereafter. And I like to say, Canadian diplomats are like US Navy SEALs. We're trained to recognize a reference to Canada at 600 yards through a dust storm in a speeding car. So as we were zipping along, I said, stop, stop. And I got out, and there's someone in the robes of the University of Toronto. And I look at the name at the bottom, it says Davidson Black. So I go and I look into the history of Davidson Black. So Davidson Black grew up in Toronto in 1880 and was very interested in the natural world, and he would go fishing in Ashbridges Bay, and he was interested in ducks and frogs and salamanders. He went to the University of Toronto, got a medical degree, served in World War I, and eventually got involved in what's called paleoanthropology, so the history of early humans. He was also interested in anatomy, so he had all the right background. And the Rockefeller Foundation sent him to Beijing, to what is now Beijing University, to head up the anthropology section of this new university. And this was at a time when all the great anthropologists were going to Central Asia, going to China, hired a Chardin, all these, the great Japanese, the Americans, the French. And so Davidson Black said, I'm in heaven here with all these great people. And it was, so Black is working away in Beijing, and a Chinese researcher brings him a molar, a tooth. And he says, this looks really strange and special. And Black helps to make the determination that this is indeed part of an entirely new, the identification of a new step in human evolution. And it's significant enough as they bring in more pieces of the skull of this poor individual to call it Peking man. So he's part of this great discovery. But why Black is important to the Chinese is all of the foreign professors at the site said, okay, well, we'll just take it to Tokyo University, or let me just ship this off to Harvard and we'll get an answer for you, or the Sorbonne would be happy to look at it. And Black said, no, this should be developed in China. We should have Chinese researchers come in. We need this. This is a great find for China. And he was so dedicated that he actually died at his desk in Beijing. And for the Chinese, this is a quintessentially Canadian characteristic. Again and again, you find, I went to the event marking the 100th anniversary of this incredible, huge medical school in southwest China with a gigantic hospital, founded in 1910 by people including a Canadian husband and wife, both doctors. He helped to found the Red Cross in China and she started the Anti-Foot Binding League. So they started this hospital, still remembered by the Chinese people. So there's a kind of a current in Canadian life, maybe non-colonial, pretty democratic, pragmatic, that it resonates in Chinese society. They think that's what we're like. They're delighted to find us. So I'm an optimist when I think about the advantages we bring. I think these are quintessentially Canadian characteristics, but we better start using them quickly because the world is changing. Thank you.
With the Doha development round being stalled at the WTO over the last decade, many countries have now sought bilaterally to set the new rules of trade. And so, depending on your beliefs, either fortunately or unfortunately, CETA was passed. TTIP is a huge question mark, and now TPP is a question mark. And for all we know, NAFTA is now a question mark as well. So in response to TPP, China has been creating RCEP. So what are and both of those have some fundamental differences, like investor-state dispute settlement. So, and then a month or so ago, China was here in Canada and they announced continued talks on a Canada-China trade agreement. So in your opinion, what would a China-led, if RCEP were to pass and that writes the new rules of trade, what does that look like? And then in your opinion, what would a Canada-China trade agreement, and what are some of the benefits that could bring, or some of the downfalls?
This obviously is an issue that is resonating in a whole bunch of societies and linked with concerns about the impact and the differentiated impact of globalization. All that said, I think that in any kind of arrangement with the Chinese, you're better off with more rules than fewer. And we have seen an evolution in the way that China responds to international agreements and how it deals with foreign partners, including partners like New Zealand and Australia most recently. And what we're seeing too, this has been evident for some time, the air went out of the WTO balloon some time ago. And I can recall when I was a senior official for APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation for Canada, they were already talking about the spaghetti bowl of individual agreements. So the Chinese, by the way, were prepared to offer and to begin negotiations on free trade with Prime Minister Harper in 2012. And they uncharacteristically said in the planning stages, we should talk about this. Let's talk about this. Normally, they would make you pay for the ability to sit down and talk with them. So the Australians negotiated a free trade agreement with the Chinese, and it took 10 years. But that 10 years also represented something of an evolution in China's capacity and in its thinking. We're also seeing a diversity of views in China as you actually have Chinese investors in Canada. There are more people who have more of a stake in things. So my view is it's better to sit down and begin negotiations with the Chinese. Nobody says we have to negotiate a bad deal. There are new topics and new areas that we need to look at, but talking to them and working with them is better than not having something in place, and having mechanisms with them where you're dealing with the Ministry of Commerce, you're dealing with other parts of the Chinese government, allows you to intervene, to understand in ways that would otherwise be closed off to you. I spent a lot of time negotiating with Chinese quarantine officials because they sometimes seem to act quite arbitrarily. And I can recall, and they're doing this again, when they cut off shipments of Canadian canola, which is rapeseed. It's an agricultural product. And it took a long time to reopen the market, but we were able to reopen the market, and we were able to reopen the market both through negotiation, but also finding Chinese end users who wanted that Canadian product. Not just people who were crushing canola seed, but people who used canola meal for a cattle feed. So as China opens up, you can have these richer and deeper conversations. I also found that as we were negotiating with the Chinese quarantine officials, we had to talk to them about areas where China wanted access to the Canadian market. So trade is a two-way street. You have to listen, you have to consult. Obviously, those consultations have to include those at home, constituencies who have concerns. But to me, the ultimate thing is we have to apply the laws that we already have on the books. We need to vigilantly apply our environmental laws. We need to apply our labor laws. And sometimes China is looking to circumvent both, particularly labor laws. So we need to be vigilant. When it comes to investment, let's not forget too that not just Chinese companies that skirt the rules. We've had major oil spills by multinational companies, European and American and Canadian, and we've had significant misbehavior by major international banks, and not necessarily just Chinese banks. So I think we tend to be pretty good at negotiating when we sit down and do it. These agreements are evolving, but it's better to be in discussions with the Chinese than not in discussions with them, what I would think.
I'd like to invite forward Father Ron McDonnell of Scarborough Missions to formally thank Mr. Mulroney on our behalf.
Good evening. Last night we welcomed President Mulroney at Scarborough Missions, and I can assure you no one fell asleep. You heard the same talk. And I'm happy to be here this evening as well with you at St. Jerome's University for this series of lectures in Catholic experience. And I'd like to thank Professor Vanine and also President Bergman for the opportunity to be involved in this. We were very happy and excited that President Mulroney accepted to be our speaker because of the topic of China. Anytime you say China to Scarborough missionaries, we sort of go into a swoon. Scarborough Missions, our roots are in China. We were founded in 1918 by Monsignor Fraser, John Mary Fraser, a Toronto priest. He had studied in the seminary in Genoa, Italy, and there he met missionaries coming from China, and they spoke to him about China. And that's where his call veered from being a Toronto diocesan priest to going to China. And so he founded this society. And in fact, our central house in Scarborough and Kingston Road was known initially as the China Mission College. Scarborough missionaries worked in China in the diocese of Lishui, which was given as their responsibility. It's south of Shanghai. And Monsignor Fraser established a seminary there in the town of Jinhua. And many Scarborough priests served there, and the people in the surrounding area, and 2 Chinese men became priests. After the Communist Revolution in 1949, all missionaries, including Scarborough missionaries, were expelled from the country, and Scarborough established missions in other countries. Monsignor Fraser went to Japan, where he worked until his death in 1962, and he's buried in Osaka, Japan. In 1979, a Scarborough priest was able to enter China, not as a missionary, but as an English teacher at a university. And since then, several Scarborough missionaries, both priests and lay people, and many others from other institutions, have served in this capacity, teaching English at university. And currently, we have 1 Scarborough missionary working in a university near Shanghai. On my sabbatical year in 2007, I had the opportunity to visit China for 2 months, our missionaries there, and I saw the places where Scarborough missionaries had worked. I went to Jinhua, and I saw the facade of the old seminary. Behind it's all grown up in weeds. But near the facade was a small building, and I discovered it was a small chapel, a church, with a 2nd floor apartment, and I could see someone hanging out his laundry, and it was the Chinese priest. So I went and he invited me in, and we had some lunch. Now, he didn't know much English, and I don't know very much Mandarin, but he tried out a German phrase on me, "Du drinkst beer." And I said, "Ja, ja." In the another experience I had was in the town of Jintian. And there I met Father Stephen Moe in his 80s. He's since passed away. And he had worked with Scarborough missionaries and so spoke English. And he knew Bishop Turner, our 1 bishop there, very well. Father Moe spent 30 years under house arrest during the Cultural Revolution. And I was just in awe at this man, this witness that he had of his Christian faith and his beautiful smile and his sharing. So I gained an appreciation of our Scarborough history just by being there, and the complexities of living with the dragon by just a short visit. And in your book, Middle Power, Middle Kingdom, President Mulroney, you give a brief account of Canadian missionary history in China. And you talk about Scarborough missions on page 233. My favorite part. Anyway, I'd like to sincerely thank you, President Mulroney, for your excellent talk this evening. You've shown that it's not black and white in approaching the dragon. It's neither total adulation or rejection, but there are many nuances and complexities in living in China and in relating to the Chinese people. I think I would like to suggest that you and your wife are missionaries too. As Scarborough missionaries, we've learned to be missionaries without naming ourselves as missionaries, but by your convictions of your Christian faith and your witness and your sensitivity to the Chinese people, I believe you have announced God's mission, God's love to the Chinese people. And so on behalf of Scarborough Missions and all of us here this evening, I offer you a sincere thank you. And I say those two very important words in Mandarin, 谢谢.
So just some announcements before we finish up in here for the evening. And first of all, I want to sincerely thank the Scarborough Missions for their ongoing commitment to these lectures and for their generosity in endowing this particular Scarborough Missions lecture. And I'm glad that Father Ron could be with us again this evening. Secondly, we send out regular emails about upcoming speakers and events. So if you're not currently on our mailing list and you want to receive information about the lectures in Catholic Experience, other lectures and events taking place here, please make sure to sign up in the atrium. Every year, St. Jerome's University is pleased to present a program of speakers to the community, and we're glad that we can make them available to you free of charge. And we're able to do this because of the generosity of so many partners and supporters. If you too would like to support the lectures, there are donation envelopes available in the atrium. And as always, a big thank you to a sense of gratitude to all of you who have given so generously to support this initiative. If you missed it when you came in, there are a number of wonderful fairly traded products available for sale in the atrium by our Social Justice Committee. And you know, there is a season coming up, so you might want to stock up. Fairly traded products are good things to purchase for Christmas. Our local independent bookseller, Wordsworth Books, is with us this evening again, so please make sure to visit their table. They do have copies of Mr. Mulroney's book, Middle Power, Middle Kingdom, and he has graciously agreed to be in the atrium and sign copies if you would like. The next lecture in Catholic Experience is going to take place on Friday, December the 9th, and it is entitled The Scandal of Grace. Shane Claiborne is a renowned activist, a self-proclaimed recovering sinner who writes and speaks around the world about peacemaking, social justice, and Jesus. He's the founder of The Simple Way in Philadelphia, and he is the executive director of Red Letter Christians. So with ancient stories of the early Christians, contemporary stories of ordinary radicals, stories from the streets of Philadelphia and the war zone of Iraq, Mr. Claiborne is going to reflect with us on the scandal of God's inclusive love in a world that is starved for grace. And finally, I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. Wonderful as always to have you with us. Thank you to you if you haven't done so, but thank you if you spread the word about our lectures. I hope to see you in December. For now, have a safe trip home this evening, and we'll see you again. Good night.